Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is where we take a deep dive into serious theological sources to give you the clarity and insight you need on the weightiest topics.
Today, we are opening up excerpts from Charles Spurgeon's celebrated work, The Treasury of David, specifically focusing on his exposition of Psalm 44.
And this isn't just an academic exercise. This psalm, it grapples with one of the most agonizing spiritual questions that any believer can face.
It really does. Our mission here is to walk through how Spurgeon understood this text. You'll notice the title includes the word mashil, which tells us it's designed specifically for teaching.
And it's a very unusual kind of teaching, isn't it? It expresses this absolute faith and this agonizing sorrow almost in the same breath.
Exactly. It's the voice of the church, the covenant people during times of severe persecution. It gets at how ancient Israel, and by extension, how you, the Christian believer, can maintain fidelity when you feel completely abandoned by the sovereign God you trust.
So to help us get our arms around it, we can follow Spurgeon's outline. He divides it into four main movements, plus a kind of a critical pivot point. The whole thing is structured like a formal argument being presented before a king.
Right. And any good argument starts by establishing your credentials, so to speak.
So first we get the rehearsal of ancient works. That's verses 1 through 3. They're recalling God's undeniable, mighty acts in history.
Then they apply that history to their present moment. That's the strong expression of faith in verses 4 through 8. They declare God's sovereignty and their confidence in him, even when everything seems to be falling apart.
And this is where the mood just plummets. Third, the tone darkens completely, and we get this wrenching complaint and distress in verses 9 through 16.
Yeah.
This is really the heart of the lament.
It's visceral. But before they make their final request, there's this necessary interlude, this assertion of fidelity in verses 17 through 22. The people insist on their innocence, that they've kept the covenant, and that's critical for their final plea.
And that final plea, the resolution, is the entreaty for interposition in verses 23 through 26. This is where we see where their hope truly rests. It's a very tightly structured argument addressed to heaven.
It is a powerful piece of writing.
All right, so let's unpack that opening movement, what Spurgeon calls the glorious history of grace, starting in Psalm 44, verses 1 through 3. The psalmist begins by anchoring his generation to the past with a simple, powerful line. We have heard with our ears, O God.
That phrase, with our ears, is so important. It points directly to how knowledge was passed down in the covenant community. Spurgeon notes that this history wasn't just preserved by reading scrolls.
It was oral tradition.
It was oral tradition. Our fathers have told us.
And when you stop and think about that, the difference between reading some dry history book and having your own father recount a miraculous national deliverance, it's night and day. It makes the knowledge so personal.
It really does. It highlights the vivid, personal, and, soul-stirring nature of that transmission. Spurgeon suggests that what we hear with our ears affects us far more sensitively, more emotionally, than what we just read with our eyes.
So this history wasn't meant to be some dusty old artifact.
No, not at all. It was meant to be the vibrant, personal story of their family's very existence.
Which puts a huge amount of responsibility on the previous generation, doesn't it? Spurgeon points out that godly fathers are the ideal instructors, that they're ordained by nature and grace to do this.
Absolutely. He says they shouldn't delegate this sacred duty to others. When that transmission is strong, history becomes a cheerful conversation. It's not some burdensome religious task.
But he also paints the opposite picture, the contrast.
He does, a sharp, melancholic contrast.
Yeah.
He talks about the lamentable state when fathers are, and this is his phrase, tongue-tied religiously with their own children.
And if that history of God's saving work isn't being shared, what fills that vacuum?
Well, when fathers are silent about what God has done, Spurgeon asks, is it any wonder if their children's hearts remain sin-tied? If the teaching focuses too much on just moral opinion or religious rules without grounding it in the hard historical facts of God's intervention, it just loses its power.
The covenant history has to be rehearsed.
It has to be, so that the children see God's hand in all the events of the world.
So what was the core of this history they were passing down? It wasn't just, ancient trivia. It was what work thou didst. The focus is entirely on God's action.
That is the crucial observation. The main thing being transmitted was the work of God. That, for Spurgeon, is the true core of history. He suggests that no one can write history rightly or teach it well if they are a stranger to the Lord's work.
So they were taught to see God's footprints everywhere.
Yes, to see his footprints on the sea of changing world events, to see him riding on the whirlwind of war, pestilence, and famine, and to see, through all of it, his unchanging care for his chosen people.
And the psalm immediately gives the most powerful case study of that work, the conquest of Canaan. This becomes the prime example of free, sovereign grace in action.
It's the ultimate Old Covenant example of salvation by grace alone. Spurgeon really drills down on the specific historical acts in that phrase, "How thou didst drive out the heathen with thy hand." We know from other places in Scripture that this conquest wasn't purely military.
Right, it involved miracles that happened even before the fighting started.
Exactly. God sent a plague that ate up the inhabitants, and he sent hornets to dispirit the enemy, to erode their will to fight before Joshua's armies even showed up.
So Joshua's victories weren't the cause of the conquest.
No, they were merely the results of God's prior unseen work. This highlights a principle of secondary causality. Man acts, but God is the primary cause of the result.
And this dual action of God vengeance on one hand, mercy on the other, is a really sobering truth that runs all through the Old Testament.
It is. Vengeance on the ungodly nations, like the Amorites, who had filled up the measure of their iniquity. And at the same time, this tremendous, undeserved mercy for the chosen tribes of Israel.
It illustrates something weighty about God's nature.
It does. The greatness of divine love has its counterpart in the greatness of divine indignation and justice. Spurgeon makes a rather striking statement that hell is as deep as heaven is high.
What's he getting at with that analogy?
He's saying that God's might is fully shown in both his justice and his mercy. The same God who troubled his enemies with plagues is the one who smiled on his friends and caused Israel to flourish. You can't really appreciate the depth of grace shown to Israel unless you understand the justifiable wrath poured out on the nations that oppose them.
So this whole historical rehearsal, it's not about national pride for Israel. It serves a single crucial purpose.
It leads directly into the core theological point, the renunciation of self-reliance in verse 3.
Right. And verse 3 is maybe the most critical verse in this whole opening section. It states it so emphatically. They got not the land in possession by their own sword.
The valor, the strategy, the size of the army, it was all secondary.
I mean, they did fight. They had swords and armies.
They did, but their success was wholly due to the Lord. Spurgeon often points to the fall of Jericho's walls as the prime evidence. A dramatic display where human effort would have been totally futile without God's direct intervention. The soldiers were there, but the victory belonged to God alone.
So the psalmist sets up this powerful negative right from the start. Neither did their own arms save them. It stops them from taking credit.
It does, and this is a parable for salvation itself, isn't it? It's the very essence of what we, in Reformed thinking, call sola gratia, grace alone. The whole passage is a beautiful model for the work of spiritual salvation. Well, we use prayer, we exercise repentance, we follow the ordinances, but none of those things save a man. Salvation is altogether of the Lord. Canaan was not conquered without the armies of Israel, but it was absolutely not conquered by them. Man is always, in every single case, just an instrument in the hand of the conqueror.
Okay, so if it wasn't human strength, what was the source of the victory? The psalmist gives this trio, thy right hand and thine arm, and the light of thy countenance.
It's a beautiful way of putting it. First, the divine hand was actively fighting for them. Second, the divine arm was powerfully sustaining them. But maybe most beautifully, the divine smile, the light of thy countenance, that inspired them with courage.
That light of thy countenance really speaks to the emotional and spiritual fuel for the fight.
Precisely. Spurgeon asks, who could fail to win with that kind of help? The physical strength of the giants, the terror of iron chariots, the number of enemies, none of it meant anything when Jehovah arose for Israel. His presence alone guaranteed success.
And the single overriding reason for all of it, the ultimate cause, because thou hast a favor unto them.
And that is the absolute truth that undergirds all of covenant history. It is the fountain from which every stream of mercy flows. The Lord's delight in his people, his peculiar affection, his distinguishing regard, that's the mainspring of their history.
It's all about election.
It is. Israel was a chosen nation, which is why they had temporal victories. Believers are an elect people, which is why we have spiritual blessings and conquests.
And if the source of success is just favor, that completely removes any room for boasting in ourselves.
Completely. There was nothing in the people themselves, not their size, morality, or military skill, that secured their success. The Lord's favor alone did it. This sovereign act is why our hope of final glory can't rest on anything in us, but solely on the free and sovereign favor of the Lord of hosts. This historical review sets the standard. God's action is the only source of hope.
That principle, established by looking at the past, sets the stage perfectly for the second section, where the people move from history to declaring their present confidence in their king.
Yeah.
It begins so powerfully in verse 4. Thou art my king, O God.
It's a personal declaration of homage. It links the speaker's own interest in God, my king, to his right to plead for the entire covenant people. After recounting those past miracles, the heart is just glad to own him as sovereign.
Right. Who else would you turn to for ultimate aid?
Exactly. And so their faith, you see, isn't shaken by their current problems because they remember who is in charge. And based on that allegiance, the declaration immediately turns into a prayer, command deliverances for Jacob.
Which is the responsibility of the king.
It is. A people look to their king to fight their battles, and in the case of our King Jehovah, a single word can do it. A simple command can free his people from any bondage.
And why this shift to Jacob there specifically instead of Israel?
Spurgeon sees Jacob as a type here, referring to the tried family of the faithful. Jacob's long life was, after all, just crowded with trials and deliverances from Esau, from Laban, from famine.
And from his own wrestling.
And from his own spiritual wrestling. So his descendants are called by his name to show the similarity of their experience. The one who is personally assured that the Lord is their king should be the first to plead for the rest of the tried family.
This conviction of sovereignty then leads right into the expectation of victory in verse 5. Through thee will we push down our enemies.
That metaphor speaks to the intense closeness of the spiritual fight. It's not about long-range weapons like bows and arrows. This is hand-to-hand wrestling, pushing, tugging. It suggests a desperate struggle that requires immense personal effort but still relies on divine strength.
It sounds like Jacob's wrestling match is being replayed in his descendants.
It has that same spiritual intensity, and the jubilant valor comes out in the second half of the verse. Through thy name will we tread them under that rise up against us.
That imagery of treading under or pushing down, it sounds so confident, almost ecstatic.
It does. The image, as some commentators see it, is taken from a strong ox tossing dogs into the air with its horn and then trampling them. It's a metaphor for buoyant, almost joyful courage.
The Lord's name is their weapon.
Exactly. It replaces the traditional horn or shield, and it enables them to leap on their foes and crush them. When saints are in complete communion with God, they work wonders.
But it's crucial that the psalm keeps saying, it's all through thee and through thy name. It keeps them from sliding back into that self-reliance they just denounced.
It is crucial. We face a dual danger in the spiritual battle. On one hand, we can't go to war at our own charges, relying on our own wit or strength, or we will fail. But we also have to avoid the equally dangerous sin of distrust, believing God can't use us.
Right. He can make the weakest believer equal to any emergency.
He can. Those who might fall on their own are, by divine assistance, made to utterly overthrow their foes.
And this confidence leads to that definitive rejection of human means in verses 6 and 7. I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me.
This is a complete renunciation of all outward confidences. Their abilities, their experience, their shrewdness, their wealth. Spurgeon highlights that the bow was a formidable weapon, yet here it is, laid aside with the sword, to make room for absolute, singular faith in the living God.
It sounds like a believer's catechism, a confession of faith.
That's a great way to put it. It serves as the confession of faith for every believer who renounces their own righteousness and strength, looking to Christ alone. Human nature is so apt to fix its trust on the power of the creature, isn't it?
We want to have a hand in our own rescue.
We do, especially in our own sanctification.
Yeah.
But the psalm is clear. All rescues have been due to God alone.
And verse 7 confirms this historical pattern. Thou hast saved us from our enemies. In the past, God always saved them, and what's more, confounded their enemies.
And confounding the enemies is part of the saving action. Thou hast put them to shame that hated us. The enemy is defeated in a way that ensures they are ashamed to be overthrown by such puny adversaries.
That is a consistent pattern in Scripture.
A glorious one. Pharaoh is drowned while Israel passes through. Amalek is smitten while the tribes rejoice. God blesses his people while simultaneously humiliating their enemies.
This section then wraps up with this glorious response in verse 8, laudable boasting. In God we boast all the day long.
And this is the only kind of boasting that is acceptable and pleasing to God. Spurgeon says all other boasting is loathsome and sinful except for this glorying in the Lord. They have abundant, continuous reason for praise when they recount his eternal love, his election, their redemption.
A praise that should last all the day long. And right there, we hit the Selah. That declaration of perpetual praise just stops cold.
And that pause is critical. It marks a decisive shift in the emotional and spiritual climate of the psalm. The Selah here is the transition from Miriam's timbrel, the sound of pure historical joy, to Rachel's weeping, the crushing sorrow of the present crisis.
We move from what God did to what he seems to be doing now.
A jarring shift.
It really is. We move into section 3, the desolation of apparent abandonment, verses 9 through 16. They've just finished their glorious boasting, and immediately they say, "But thou hast cast off and put us to shame."
The contrast is deliberately shocking. The psalmist contrasts the glorious past with the nation's agonizing present, and crucially, they don't attribute the affliction to a failure of human courage or the accidents of war.
No, they attribute it solely and alone to the withdrawal of Israel's God.
That's it. The implication is, if God had been with them, they would have won, as they always had. It seems like Jehovah has grown weary of his people.
That perception of abandonment, that feeling that God has walked away, is the entire cause of their complaint.
Right. Now, we know, theologically, that God will not cast away his people finally. But churches and individuals have been left to defeat and disgrace. And the evidence for this divine withdrawal is clear. God goeth not forth with our armies.
And if the Lord isn't the field general, then the army is useless.
Worse than useless, it becomes a source of ridicule. Vain are the combined efforts of the most zealous workers and cleverest strategists if God's arm isn't revealed. If the great ally won't go with the church in its ministry, then defeat is simply inevitable.
And the immediate consequence of that withdrawal is military defeat, which is then followed by what Spurgeon calls spoliation.
Spoliation. After defeat comes plunder. Spiritually, we know what this is. When God leaves us to ourselves, even for a short time, doubts and fears rush in like thieves and rob us of our comforts. Terrible forebodings spoil us of our hopes.
The loss of assurance is the deepest kind of robbery.
It is. No earthly calamity can equal the sorrow of feeling left by God, even if we believe it's for wise, sovereign purposes.
And the imagery they use in verse 11 is just horrifyingly intimate. Thou hast given us like sheep appointed for meat.
They were slain in flocks with ease and frightening frequency. They were treated not with the dignity of a sacrifice, but with the cruelty of the shambles, the slaughterhouse. And they were scattered among the heathen, far from the temple and public worship.
And throughout this entire section, the psalmist is tracing all of this sorrow directly to the hand of God, seeing it as being allowed and even appointed by him.
Yes, that acknowledgement of God's sovereignty in suffering is characteristic of the Psalms, even in deep complaint. But the bitterest point of all, perhaps, is in verse 12. Thou sellest thy people for naught.
They weren't just conquered. They were given away like they were valueless.
And the sting of it is aggravated by the second half of the verse. And dost not increase thy wealth by their price. They weren't sold for any strategic advantage. It appears that the Lord's name received no honor from their suffering. They were given away as if they weren't even worth the ordinary price of a slave.
Which creates this feeling that their suffering is pointless.
That feeling of futility is a grievous aggravation of misery. And Spurgeon actually steps in here in his commentary to offer some necessary comfort and theological balance.
What comfort can there be when a people feel they're being sold for nothing?
Spurgeon reminds the reader, though no revenue of visible glory is rendered to God now, and though the suffering seems futile, the Lord nonetheless accomplishes his own secret, sovereign purposes. He assures us that our griefs are not without result, even if we can't see the gain right now.
So we don't suffer for naught.
No, the final accounting will prove otherwise.
The suffering then spills out into public scorn in verses 13 through 16. They become a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and a derision.
And scorn is an intensely bitter ingredient in the cup of the oppressed. Spurgeon says the taunts of the victors often pain the vanquished as much as their swords. The peculiar people of God had become a common jest, a byword among the heathen.
They had sunk so low they were treated as infamous, despicable.
They were the common butts of every fool's arrow. This is what the world offers its true nobility. We see this principle fully played out when the world found a cross for the Master himself.
The psalmist isn't just venting here, is he?
No, he is setting forth the brutality of the enemy, in many words, to move the pity of the Lord. It's an appeal that a father will not long endure to see his children spitefully mistreated.
And the internal reaction matches the external disgrace. The poet cries out, "My confusion is continually before me."
The shame of the face has covered him completely. It is one constant blush. And this blush is felt both before God and before man.
Why before both?
Before God, because the divine desertion, the mysterious, felt deserved, leading to a sense of guilt. And before man, because they were despicable and powerless now that heavenly help was gone. Spurgeon saw this as a sign of national health, that there were still men who truly made the people's case their own.
And the situation gets even worse in verse 16. The enemy's offense escalates.
It does. They move from simply mocking the people to reviling God himself. They advance from persecution to outright blasphemy. The enemy boasted of avenging the defeats of their forefathers, those ancient victories at the Red Sea. They took revenge by insulting the now fallen people and, more grievously, by insulting the God who had apparently abandoned them.
This puts the nation in a terrible spot. The honor of Jehovah's name is now at stake.
Exactly. But this is the key. As the psalmist noted, it is not a hopeless case. If Israel looks to her God, no foe can retain her beneath his foot. But first, they have to address the elephant in the room. Why is this happening if they haven't apostatized?
Which brings us to that pivotal fourth section, the assertion of fidelity in verses 17 to 22. Despite everything, the slaughter, the shame, the blasphemy, they assert their spiritual integrity. All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee?
This is a powerful, startling counter-argument directed toward heaven. It challenges the assumption that their suffering must be due to some recent national apostasy. True fidelity, Spurgeon observes, has to be able to withstand rough usage.
So it's a kind of test. Those who follow God only for the good times will inevitably leave him when persecution comes.
But the sincere believer, the truly covenanted people, will not forget their God, even though the worst come to the worst. They insist on genuine covenant adherence. Neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant.
What exactly does that claim mean?
It means that no idol was set up publicly, the ordained worship was maintained, and God was still nationally acknowledged as the one true king. Spurgeon notes that the entire psalm is suitable for the lips of martyrs, who suffer not for sin in general, but specifically for righteousness' sake.
So, not for having forsaken the Lord, but for firing hard after him.
Yes. Such suffering is terrible, painful, but exceedingly honorable.
And their fidelity wasn't just outward ritual, it was a fidelity of the inner life. Verse 18, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way.
This is the critical spiritual claim. Heart and life were agreed, and both were true to the Lord's way. They were free from willful, deliberate, nationally sanctioned transgression that would warrant this kind of abandonment. It shows that their affliction evidently came from a different cause than outright apostasy.
But this raises a serious theological question, especially from a Reformed perspective that holds to total depravity. How can the psalmist, speaking for the nation, claim they haven't dealt falsely in the covenant?
That is the essential tension. They are not claiming sinless perfection. That would indeed contradict the doctrine of total depravity and the need for God's mercy. Rather, they are claiming sincerity of allegiance.
So they're saying that their distress is not a punishment for current idolatry.
Exactly. They haven't broken the covenant in the way their forefathers often did, by setting up high places or worshiping Baals. This distinction is vital. They claim sincerity, which still leaves them in desperate need of redemption, as the final verse will confirm.
Understood. But even with that sincere fidelity, verse 19 describes the severity of the trial with terrifying metaphors. Though thou hast sore brokenness in the place of dragons.
Place of dragons refers to desolate, ruined places, often where cruel, poisonous enemies like jackals or serpents haunt. Historically, the church has interpreted this as reflecting the seat of the greatest persecution, pagan or papal persecution, the spiritual seat of Satan, the great red dragon.
The environment itself is hostile and desolate.
To be true to a smiting God, even when the blows have laid all our comforts in ruinous heaps, is the kind of character the Lord delights in. Spurgeon reminds us of a crucial principle. It is infinitely better to be broken by God, to suffer under his hand, than to be broken from God, to yield to temptation and forsake the covenant.
And the atmosphere of despair is made complete. God has covered us with the shadow of death.
This signifies being completely enveloped in darkness and hopelessness. They are crushed, desolate, surrounded by mortal danger, yet the glorious plea remains that they are still mindful of their God. Spurgeon concludes, better death than false of faith.
And their final defense against any accusation of hidden sin is an appeal to omniscience in verses 20 and 21. They hadn't forgotten God's name, nor had they stretched out our hands to a strange god.
Stretching out the hands was the ancient, universal symbol of adoration and prayer. They assert they had not offered this sincere worship to any idol, even in secret. And the rhetorical question that follows is unanswerable. Shall not God search this out? Could such idolatry be concealed from him?
The answer is immediately supplied. For he knoweth the secrets of the heart.
Right. God is intimately acquainted with the innermost workings of the mind. Spurgeon notes the emphasis here. Not just the heart, which is already secret, but the secrets of the heart. The most deeply hidden motivations are open to God like a book.
The reasoning is clear.
Yes. The Lord himself knows the people to be sincerely his followers in this distress. Therefore, their affliction must not be a visitation for national sin.
This realization leads directly to the profound martyr's reason for suffering in verse 22. Yea, for thy sake.
Assuredly, certainly, their trials came upon them not for their offenses, but because they were loyal to their God. Their difficulties arose precisely because they were obeying him and refusing to compromise with the pagan nations around them. They suffered because they would not forsake their covenant God and King.
They were killed all the day long, meaning the persecution never ceased, and they were counted as sheep for the slaughter.
They were treated as if they were made on purpose to be victims, as if it were an easy and innocent thing to slay them. This is the agonized cry that ascends to heaven from martyrs throughout history, from the Waldenses in Piedmont to the Reformation martyrs at Smithfield. They suffer because they are the covenant people.
This verse is so crucial that the Apostle Paul quotes it in Romans 8:36. But there's a really important difference in tone between the psalmist here and Paul's use of the same text.
This contrast provides immense teaching for us. The psalmist here is lamenting that this affliction is terrible and seemingly without just cause from their end. They feel abandoned despite their fidelity. But St. Paul, when he quotes this verse, views the persecution not as an incomprehensible tragedy, but as something conquerable and even glorious.
Paul can see the end result of the suffering.
Exactly. Under the new covenant, Paul could rejoice in persecutions and exclaim, "Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors, through him that loved us." The outward experience is the same, being killed for Christ's sake. But the theological interpretation and the resulting posture are fundamentally different.
So the new covenant believer has a fullness of assurance.
That's it. Knowing that nothing, not even this ultimate suffering, can separate them from the love of Christ. The psalmist is pleading from the trial. Paul is exclaiming victory over the trial.
We transition now to section 5, the final cry for help and mercy in verses 23 through 26. Despite their fidelity and despite the honor in their suffering, the distress is too great and the people must plead for intervention. They cry, "Awake! Why sleepest thou, O Lord?"
This is a rhetorical request born of deep spiritual distress. It reflects the human perception of God's utter inaction, not a theological truth. Psalm 121 confirms, "He who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep."
So the psalmist puts it this way because he can't explain the divine silence otherwise.
Exactly. They want to see the great judge ending their oppression, and they follow up with, "Wherefore hidest thou thy face?"
It sounds like they're authorized, even in the midst of this mystery, to question God's perceived distance.
This is not petulance or rebellion, but a piteous inquiry. We are permitted, even when God's dealings are mysterious, to order our case with arguments and plead the right before God. They are essentially asking, "Why, Lord, do you seem oblivious to your children's woes when we are suffering for your name's sake?" This act of pleading is itself an act of fidelity.
The psalm then quickly moves to describe the agonizing depth of their misery in verse 25. Our soul is bowed down to the dust.
When the heart sinks, the man is down indeed. Heart sorrow is the heart of sorrow. If the soul is bowed, the whole person is defeated. But they go further. Our belly cleaveth unto the earth.
That sounds like a description of being utterly flattened, incapable of getting up.
They're not just down, but fastened down, glued to the ground by utter despondency. This physical description is a powerful metaphor for the soul's inability to escape its own dejection. And Spurgeon reminds us here that even God's saints may reach this low point like Job in the ashes or Lazarus at the gate.
But the low point is not the end of the story.
Never. Their day of deliverance is coming. Their tide will turn. They shall have a brave summer after their bitter spiritual winter. They must be entirely broken before they can be completely raised up.
The psalm then reaches its simple, urgent final petition in verse 26, condensing everything into 2 lines. Arise for our help.
That is the short, simple, urgent prayer for divine intervention. But the true theological conclusion rests in the final line. which is the ultimate destination of the whole psalm. And redeem us for thy mercy's sake.
This is the moment where the claim of fidelity in verse 17 meets the absolute demand of grace. Even after claiming they haven't forgotten God, the final plea cannot and must not rest on their own righteousness.
That is the absolute beautiful illustration of sovereign grace. Mercy is always the safest plea. The plea is redemption, and the reason for that redemption is God's sheer undeserved favor, his mercy.
So even if you were a martyr at the stake.
As Spurgeon concludes, if one were a martyr at the stake, having lived a life of exceptional faithfulness, he should still plead his Savior's name, entreat a pardon for his sake, and urge no other claim than God's mercy. The whole structure proves that even our best righteousness is insufficient.
The power of this psalm ends not with their complaint or their claim, but it ascends to heaven, bringing down deliverance because of his mercy alone.
Amen to that.
That was a tremendous deep dive into Spurgeon's handling of Psalm 44. We've seen how absolutely necessary history is in forming our current faith by the traditions of God's past workings, specifically his distinguishing regard.
And how true fidelity is evidenced not in ease, but in affliction. The saints' declaration of covenant adherence is astonishing, yet even then the covenant people always appeal to sovereign mercy, not personal merit. That is the consistent line of Reformed theological thought.
The structure itself is a teaching tool, moving from a confident retrospective look at God's mighty actions in the past to a desperate, future-focused plea based entirely on God's unchanging nature for thy mercy's sake.
Right. The traditions of our past experience become powerful arguments and pleas for present help. The church or the individual believer may feel disgraced, treated as if sold for naught. But what stands out here is that principle Spurgeon cited. Even when no visible glory is rendered to him now, God nonetheless accomplishes his own secret purposes, and our griefs are not without result.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today?
Well, consider this provocative thought. In the midst of your current difficulties, when you feel that the Lord has seemingly withdrawn his face and your soul is bowed down to the dust, what secret purpose might God be accomplishing through that difficulty? Go forth and seek to see God's hand in your circumstances, even when his face seems hidden, knowing that your final, certain plea for deliverance rests entirely on his sovereign, distinguishing favor alone.